Yeah.
But then the next thing we're going to do is there's a study that says how to do this at the chart. How do we get so that was done like 5 or 6 years ago by actually so we're gonna like reproduce that from the beginning and run. And that I think is going to be much more. I mean, that's really useful. This one is useful if Dnsop happen. That would be really useful for us because you can actually do a lot of things. But what if the second one is just this one yeah, and then hopefully other people come. That's my intention is to do this, to talk. But I mean, I'm hoping to have it out. So someone might talk like, and I showed it, and someone said, "Why didn't you do this?" And they did it, and then it showed. Yeah. But so anyway, I'll just hold the notes and talk. Okay.
I think we'll give people a couple more minutes to finish their cookies and file in, and we'll get underway in a few minutes. I'm sorry?
Finish your cookies.
I don't have.
Am I still lately like the order of the agenda is kind of the order of it's like.
This is my time.
Okay.
That's my run sheet.
Oh,
so you're basically at the end.
5:25. Right. Okay. Fantastic. Because the reason I ask is that Sharon is doing VRFs and right next door into apartment. So I just wanted to pop out for that before coming back. And it looks like I don't run any risk of she's like second on their agenda. Okay, so
okay. If you're going to stay in there for a long time, be on Jabber so I can continue?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll totally be on Jabber. And anything else we didn't add? You added multi-response to Thursday's session?
Well, I think we're slide that in there. So.
And I suggested to Warren that he might want to have those, probably, even though this is Dnsop, that they have a week's worth of graphs.
I can slide those into
Thursday, so we'll probably get that ready. Yeah, I'll have pressure graphs.
Okay.
So
yeah,
stack.
So I'll tell him that.
So it's been noted in the Jabber room that it says 90.
Oh yeah. Okay.
But probably IETF 90 was probably here too.
Yeah, we probably were here too for IETF 90. So they can. Yeah. Okay. Okay, Mike. Thank you. Hey, at least I updated the note well. So, and I had to do it for like all the working groups, right?
Yeah, you can sit up here and be off camera, or you can talk.
No, I figure I'll do the.
Do you have the clicky? Do you want the clicky?
Oh yeah. I'll take the clicky.
Yeah, the table with this guy.
Ready?
Yep. All right, everybody. Good afternoon for the last session. Welcome to Dnsop. I'm Tim. That's Suzanne, and it is IETF 90. You just don't realize it. So, you know who we are. Joel's offered to stand up and do JabberScribe, or we forced the former AD to basically do our bidding. So, and Paul says he's going to do minutes, so I appreciate that. So please speak your name at the mic. So while we probably know people, we may not know everybody. I'm always bad about that. While I didn't get the IETF right, I did update the note well document. So this is the new text. So hopefully everybody's taking a little look at it. It doesn't seem to be a lot different than the old text. Diffs. I'm sorry, sir. We're going to ask you to step aside. We got some blue sheets going around. Please fill those in so everybody knows what's going on, how many people we have here, so we can get a big room like this. So the agenda this time, we got a 3-hour cruise. The first 2 hours is sort of previous work that we've been doing. The third hour, which is on Thursday, is what we call the IETF bad ferry work, where it's a lot of new stuff. So so the bad idea ferry will show up on Thursday and sort of drop on some new drafts and stuff like that. But mostly it's updates on current stuff going on. Quick thing on document updates. Since the last meeting, I feel this is very sad. We've only got one thing sort of published, and we'd been on a cadence of getting 3 drafts published. I know, and this is kind of my fault. I sort of got busy with work and I got sidetracked on stuff. So, but we got key tag pushed out. We do have a few things actually very close to going out. NSEC aggressive use is actually an auth 48, and the special use TLD problem statement document that wore us down to a fine grain is also an auth 48 as well. So, and refuse any, it went through a second working group last call, and I basically have corralled Joel, Joe Abley, who I saw at lunch, that he is responsible for fixing some of the outstanding items. So Oliver, you're off the hook on that. So they're pretty minor, no. So that was his free lunch. So Joe, raise your hand. Yep. We'll sit down later this week and we'll get this sort of hashed out so we can move this forward. Okay. So as we said, the LTLD is basically, now that the problem statement's done, I think we're ready to try this again. And I think it's ready for a working group last call. The IP6 document, there's a bunch of stuff that has to go in there, and we're sort of waiting on Lee, who's busy. What?
It's ready to go. We're just making sure that we don't overload people with too many,
Okay.
too many things at once, but we'll be doing an abbreviated second working group last call for IP6 RDNS.
And then, of course, the RPZ, the wonderful RPZ document that sort of caused a lot of, hullabaloo. We've worked out all the boilerplate problems, and Suzanne sent out an email earlier today, basically sort of describing that. Think of it as replace RPZ with client subnet in your mind. And the work we did with client subnet to, document what was there, make it informational. Yeah, we can write about the security things and all the things that we think are bad, but we don't actually change the protocol. That's exactly what's going to go on there. So if it bothers you on some level, just, do a replace on RPZ with client subnet and kind of move forward on that. So elsewhere in our queue, yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
So, I know it's a very new topic, but that's not what I read from Suzanne's note 2 hours ago. Paul Hoffman. So what I read from Suzanne's note is that the introduction that says, we are not talking about whether this is a good idea or a bad idea or whatever, is more the case that, so even once it comes into the working group, we don't get to then start talking about whether we think it's a good idea or not.
Okay, yeah. We're documenting.
So not like EDNS client subnet, but more like we can talk, leave the technical stuff aside, but that we are excluding certain things we're going to talk about. Suzanne, is that right?
I think you're both right, because, not that we want to spend a lot of time on it, which is why I sent it to the mailing list. But the point there was that we resolved the point that was controversial by saying we're acknowledging there's a challenge there. That's not what the document is about. The scope of the document in both cases was to say we're describing the technology as currently built and deployed, not going into the surrounding issues. This is informational for the purpose of documenting what people are doing.
Yeah. And that after that gets published, we're welcome to put out a standards track that, we go to our heart's content on, basically, which was so I believe, that's currently where things are going on that. Okay. And yes, it always does seem, we've sort of gone over it a couple times. A few other things that we have adopted, the outer leaf document, David, he's made some updates to it, and I think we're getting close enough. If we have a few more reviews for a working group last call on that, it's actually, starting to shape up. We need to get back with John about the TCP requirements. I know he's gotten some feedback since Chicago, and we want to see where that's going. So the wire format draft, that's an interesting one because there's a lot of DNS over transport stuff going on, right? So we're actually sitting down with some ADs later in the week to sort of discuss all the, or as I call them, DNS over Hoffman, protocol drafts that are out there. No offense, Paul, but just to sort of figure out how we're sort of going to where are we juggling all that sort of stuff, right? Mostly because it's been adopted, and so if we don't do something with it, because it does seem to freak out the HTTP people, we have to have a sort of a good story as to why. So, and no response. I think we just, we've had some editorial stuff on that. I think technically it's there. It's just there's some editorial stuff I think we need to sort of pull together, and that's my bad. So, one thing we're thinking about is because things like DNS terminology BIS they're making changes, and they seem small, but they're actually, because it's becoming standards tracked, we're concerned that people aren't really sort of maybe looking at all the bigger picture sort of thing. So we are sort of considering some smaller interims just for specific topics or drafts, something like an hour in length. We bang out something that people sort of, vent to their heart's content, and just basically sort of, work through some stuff. Interested in some feedback on that, if people think that's crazy or not. We just, we don't want really long sort of out of control ones. I think we figure if we can keep them, short to the point, we can sort of focus on specific things. Maybe just sort of help us move some stuff forward. So, the document list, of course, that's what we're working on. Paul's been keeping that up, and he's been really he's been keeping us on track. Me less so lately, but I think I'm hoping that that'll sort itself back out. So currently today, Paul, we're going to have Paul talk a little bit about terminology BIS, even though he has no slides. He'll just talk a little bit. Some updates on the capture format, which came out of some stuff that came out of the hackathon. Sort of caused us. We thought we were close to working group last call, but I think some stuff that came up we needed to think on that. The 5011 security considerations. Basically, the action item we have is we want to make sure that Wes and Mike hug it out today, and we get to the bottom of the big contention. And then I think we're ready to sort of move forward. An update on the A-name draft, which people seem very interested in, and some people seem very sort of frightened about. Session signaling, which I originally thought we were getting close to working group last call. I think as the authors start to dig into it more, we realize we're not there, and there's going to be some stuff. I actually haven't had a chance. I saw the slides at the very last minute. Haven't had a chance to really look at them, so we'll get details on that. And David's done a bunch of work on the bulk RR draft, which really freaked a lot of people out the first time it sort of was presented. But there is some interesting stuff in there. So I think they've actually come up with a sort of a very good simplified approach to the problem that looks like we feel is, if the group looks for it, it's probably ready for adoption. And then we may touch on some sort of the new working group business. Two sides of a multi-sided coin, as I call it. The server stale draft, and this is about, do you fetch things quickly or do you basically serve stuff out of cache? It's the whole, how do you deal when you're being attacked and, or you can't reach the authoritative servers to basically get, updates on your data, right? So there's, of course, different ways to sort of solve it. We just want to see, which way it kind of goes this way or that way sort of thing. So that's really, what we've got on the agenda for this week. Mostly today. So, so that should keep us busy for a few hours. And like I said, Thursday, we'll do a lot of the new stuff. So, if you're looking for sort of the crazy ideas that I always am welcome to sort of listen to. So, and they're not even that crazy. So that's just the way it goes. There is one thing, but you? Oh, okay. Oh, Victor, go ahead, Victor. Red button.
Yep. You're on.
Hi.
It's not down here.
Hi. So all the new Thursday, I'd like to participate. One of them I have some material I've contributed to, but I also have the UTA session where I'm deeply involved in the STS, email security thing. And I'm wondering whether it's possible to shift the algo negotiation if the authors are present and ready to the last thing today, maybe, if that's a possibility. I hope. Try not to be in two places at the same time.
Yeah, that's a late enough change to be a little bit awkward, but we'll see what we can do.
Okay,
And if we do have some time on that, maybe we can, at least start the conversation and then push it out to Thursday. And maybe is another way to put it.
So Tim, this is Shimon, author of the algorithm negotiation. So unfortunately, we're not ready. We're still working on the slides, so we won't be able to switch.
Okay.
Good to know that. So, and there was one other topic. I think you all probably saw it. There was an advisory about, it was on Vine, but I saw elsewhere about the T-SIG vulnerability, and so that had come up, and there was a discussion, a meeting this week with all the vendors, so all the major players there. Francis had put together one slide. I was going to bring that up, and we can talk about that. But basically, it's something that sounds like the vendors are all getting together to sort of work on a update to the documents to basically make it a little more explicit, sort of thing. So let me go dig the slide up, and then we can sort of move forward from there.
Okay. So I guess, Paul, it's all yours.
So this is due.
Oh.
So
I'm slide 3. So.
yeah, you're slide 3, but this was just the T-SIG.
Oh,
Yep, this was
well,
just
actually,
the.
then I'm going to go sit down because I need to take notes.
Okay, okay. Just a quick, this is just a quick thing about the T-SIG vulnerability. You want to say a few words, Mr. Morris, former chair?
Yeah, as you know, both NOS and Bind issued patches to address a T-SIG vulnerability recently. When we got together, we found that the vulnerability had the same underlying cause in both products, and we felt, so the DNS vendors got together on Sunday. We felt that a correction is needed to RSC 2845. As said in the slide, there's a section in 2845 that defines the orders that certain checks should be done. To get over this problem, we had to change the order. So we feel the correction is needed. But in addition, it became clear that 2845 doesn't cover all the cases, that some clarifications are needed. And we're concerned that if two experienced vendors make the same mistake, then new players may well make that mistake as well. So the conclusion of the meeting is that we should start work on a BIS version of 2845, just to put in those clarifications. And while we're at it, incorporate RSC 4635, which contains additional information on T-SIGs. Okay. Thanks.
Hi, so I'm Paul Hoffman, and I'm not a T-SIG vulnerability, I don't think. But I could be because I don't interoperate on that. So on the terminology document, as you've seen, there's been some traffic on the list. What it seems to be since the last meeting is we have occasional bursts of, here are 20 corrections or thoughts and such like that, and then silence for a month and such like that. I don't know if that means we're getting done, or if it means that without authors pushing, that it's not interesting enough. And so I'm going to defer to the chairs on figuring out when we're done. We have, by the way, for those of you who want to know what haven't we done, we are keeping in the issues list on GitHub. And so even if you bring up an issue on the mailing list, I will move that over to the GitHub issues list. If you have a GitHub account, it's better if you do that so that the issue doesn't look like it came from me. But so we have a couple of open issues left on that, but we have one big open issue, and that is waiting on me, and sort of like the standard, $ excuse, my day job. But one thing that we promised to do when we started the BIS document is to actually go through the mailing list from original 7719 and find, during that time, we said, oh, we'll do that in the BIS document. And there's a bunch of things that we punted and have forgotten about. And
that's painful.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
So I'm going to go through the mailing list. And so that will probably take me another month or so to start those. But the result of that will be some open issues that will be long and hard. One of them is like, Do we talk about resolution versus resolvers? And do we fix some of the terminology? In 7719, we picked some terminology because it had been written up in earlier RFCs. And so we would take the noun instead of the verb and things like that. So that will open up a bunch of issues. And I hope that this group doesn't think, oh, that's not important, because it was important enough the last time where it looked like we were going to thrash and we punted instead. It's probably still just as important as just 2 years later. So that might happen over the next couple months, and yeah.
Hi, George from APNIC. So I used to collect encyclopedias, and I had a Pears encyclopedia from about 1915 that had an article on physics that said at the end, ... some recent news from a Mr. Einstein in Zurich may change our feelings about certain statements made here. And the spirit of this is, because I know people who work in the ontology and dictionary space for years, it's never cooked.
No, it is never,
never cooked. And I feel like if you're not getting the feedback that you've actually done a substantive body of work, either decide to leave the draft open forever and we just accept it's a living dog, or cut now with open issues and roll a bis, because it's never going to finish.
Right. So I'm not in favor of keeping it open as a draft. And the reason is this. We've been getting a surprising number of documents that have nothing to do with this group referring to RFC 7719. So the number of surprising references outside has made me realize people really want an RFC. So we should get another one done, even if we have to do a third one. But yeah. And by the way, on the encyclopedia thing, encyclopedias from 1900 to about 1915 are absolutely great. If you get a chance to go through them, look at articles on things you think you know about, what they thought chemistry did was just like really, really funny. So, you know, go for that. And who knows, maybe 7719 people in 50 years will look back and go, that's not the way the DNS worked. So I do hope that people are still interested enough as we bring up issues, especially the ones that we punted on. Again, we didn't punt because we were bored. We punted because they were too controversial. And so there's going to be a couple of those coming up in the next couple months.
Thanks. I think it might be that it's been a little bit difficult to get sustained reviewer attention because this is a long and complex document. It's a little bit intimidating. People should go ahead, I guess, you know, not to speak for the authors, but it does seem that it would be valuable even if someone doesn't feel able to take on the entire document to have reviews of particular pieces or by section.
Yep.
So reviews of part of the document are also useful.
And sort of the other $ argument that people often give is, oh, if you had a PhD student, you know, have them do this research. If anyone here has PhD students who are doing anything on the DNS, especially if they're one step away and they're supposed to really understand the DNS even though they're not working on it, by all means, have that person do a thorough review of this and open issues. Those are great people for discovering what we all thought was obvious and is not. Okay. And by the way, I liked your idea of maybe having a virtual interim, you know, a call or whatever. I think that might generate, you know, the encyclopedia readers among us.
I remember in the first version of the document, there was just a large discussion about various things that we wanted to bike shed on that we put off.
Yeah.
But now that this is going to be standards track, and I think we're going to go back to these folks in the IETF and say, are you guys actually paying attention to this document, making sure you're using the right terms and stuff?
And the fact that people are starting to use 7719 despite that.
Yep.
So yeah, let's do that. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Pass that to Mr. Jim.
Right. Afternoon all, Jim Haig, Synodon. I'm here briefly to give you an update on what's going on with CDNS. For those of you who's not come across this so far, CDNS is aimed to be a file storage format that permits efficient storage in a space sense of large packet captures for DNS. It's based on CBOR, and therefore is hoped to be working in restricted environments with a relatively low overhead. And it's nearly reversible, but not quite. We don't store things like TCP session details. Basically the way it works is we combine query and responses into query response pairs. collect those into blocks of a few thousand at a time, and then abstract the common data from those blocks. And we also have optional recording of sections, RRs, and so forth. It's not the simplest file format in the world. I'll just let that sear itself onto your eyeballs and move on. Now, we presented the status of Draft 01 in Chicago. Since then, there's been a couple of new things happening. We issued a Draft 02, which was just some minor editorial improvements and correcting an image. And then in July, we issued the latest version, 03, where we've added an implementation status into the draft. But the big news is that we now have an open sourced implementation of this available on GitHub. It's C++, and you're very welcome to go and have a look at it. Multiple implementations would be nice, but I'll talk about a bit more about that in a moment. Just one note on the draft, we are currently using SVG diagrams in there, and we were talking, Sarah and I were talking to the Secretariat earlier, and I think my future may hold some ASCII art. But anyway. Right, current open questions we have. Now in Chicago, we had an open question of what to do about malformed recording malformed packets. And I'm afraid that question is still open. We haven't really thought too much about it. And this includes considering what exactly we mean by a malformed packet. It's the question of packets that are nearly correct, where, for example, you can extract a question from the query, but where there's something then goes wrong in the rest of the packet. What do we do about handling those? We would be aiming to probably record the malformed content in the file optionally. If we're going to do that, should we consider trying to compress the raw content and so forth? We also have a minor question. We've specified, part of the file specifies the configuration used to capture the data. So far, we have not made a final decision about how to handle configuration items that were just unknown at the time of the capture. But anyway, however, we've also recently received comments on 03, which have raised some interesting questions. The first one is, we have a reference in the draft at the moment to extensions for implementation dependent fields in the data that have nowhere actually described exactly how those extensions are going to work. So we need to nail down something there. And we've also had comments about potential use in a scenario where traffic reconstruction is absolutely not required. Now, we've been very much developing this from a point of view of recording pretty much everything and using it to reconstruct traffic. So being confronted with people saying, yeah, we'd like to use this, but actually we don't really want to bother about recording addresses and so forth. Subnets would be fine. We need to think about this. Currently, we have, although we have a lot of optional fields in the format, we have enough fields noted as compulsory so that we can do very basic traffic reconstruction. So we'll need to think about this. And also the question of what should be the minimal timestamp resolution, because again, the people who are interested in storage but not necessarily reconstruction have also raised the possibility of, well, we don't really care about time resolution to greater than a second. And
oh, no.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Anyway. And otherwise, we have been having, and we will look forward to having, we would like to have some more hallway discussions on other use cases. And in particular, the prospect of using it with DNS TAP has been raised recently. And I'd like to thank Stefan very much for spending his hackathon weekend generating a basic Go DNS TAP to CDNS implementation. This raises some further interesting questions in that in DNS TAP, providing anything is voluntary, as far as I can see. So, for example, Stefan discovered that, in fact, half the time you don't get to discover what the server address was, which is one of the items that we currently have as mandatory. Plus, also, DNS TAP can supply server internal information, such as the bailiwick. And we currently have no provision for recording that, and obviously that would be a very good thing if we do. So, we need some further discussion on that. If there are any DNS TAP experts or enthusiasts around, we'd love to talk to you. Which leads us on to the next steps, and the next steps are basically I think, some hallway discussions addressing these issues, and I think trying to work out the shortest steps that we need to take to nail this down as something immediately useful and proceed with the draft on that basis. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Any questions?
Paul Hoffman, just because I'm closer than Stefan, but it's one of the things Stefan's going to ask about. Do you have a reason for making some of these things mandatory?
Looking at it and from this perspective, our only reason for making things mandatory was for reconstruction.
Great. Okay, thank you. And because then if now we're loosening reconstruction, then...
Exactly, though if we loosen reconstruction, if we loosen reconstruction, there's a question of, do we put a marker in the data saying, hey, you actually haven't got enough data to reconstruct and prevent it? Do we just recommend that implementers introduce dummy data of their own if asked to reconstruct, including data that isn't there? That's an open question.
Jim Reed. Good to see this work is going ahead, Jim. I think you're all doing great stuff here. Is there any progress on the IPR issue that was been talked about in the past? Any idea when that might be getting resolved?
Okay. The only thing I can tell you about the IPR is that we're proceeding with the draft because the working group wants us to proceed with the draft. As I mentioned, we have open sourced the software. Now, that software is Mozilla public license, but it's copyright ICANN, and I refer you to the Honourable Mr. Mandelson.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Okay.
Stefan Bartmeyer. One thing that was mentioned for the problem of mandatory versus optional data would be to have two profiles of CDNS, one where everything was mandatory and one with a lot of things were optional. It would complicate a bit the grammar or the semantic description, but it would help with all the problems, because it's not only a DNS TAP problem. I mean, there are many cases where you have only a part of the data and you still want to store it. So I tend to think that this idea of two profiles is the right one.
Okay. I must admit, my only worry about profiles is whether two would end up being enough. Because, okay, we could draw a line between reconstruction and non-reconstruction, but are there going to be other potential applications where a similar line might exist? I don't know. That's why I'd like a bit more discussion about potential uses. First, if that makes sense.
yeah, it makes sense, but of course we cannot see in advance all the possible use and.
No, of course, and I think you're right. I think, if we don't come up with if we don't come across something very quickly, we should proceed on the basis of just the reconstruct or no reconstruct.
Anyway, the current draft, I'm not satisfied with the current draft in that respect, because many things in the draft are optional but are not in practice, so it doesn't make sense. That's the discussion we had about in the value 0 for the index.
Absolutely,
which is supposed to say data not found, but in practice it doesn't work.
But yes, in practice at the moment, that's a design hangover. we are doing optional data really by other means now, and that's a wart that needs to be tidied.
Roy Adams, ICANN. I'm a very heavy user of the CDNS format and the tools that Synodon have provided. I've got many feature requests on the tools and maybe a few things on the capture format itself. With regards to the tool, is there a specific mailing list that, and I know this is not about developing the standard, so I'm sorry to ask you this, but is there a mailing list that people can go to and discuss these features, et cetera, like a proper development?
Yes, there is. At the moment, we're asking people. It's on the website. I think we're asking people to use the DNS stats mailing list at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Sarah Dickinson. Yeah. So this is code that's under the DNS stats website and the DNS stats users mailing list. So that's where to go in the first instance, or feel free to put issues in the bug tracker on GitHub. The comment that I was going to make was simply a request for, if people genuinely are interested in this DNS stat use case, could we just have a little bit of traffic on the list, because there's been nothing there, everything's been off the record so far. So if we can hear on the list specific requirements about the additional data that people would like to see captured, that would really help us in moving forward to meet that use case.
Okay.
Sounds really good. Thanks, Jim. And next.
Mr. West.
Okay.
Us.
That would be you. Cookie thing.
All right, I am Wes Hardiker. Warren's over there ignoring me, and we can go on. Ignore the outline. So just as a quick reminder, in 5011, the math is sort of complex about how you generate a query interval for good reasons. It's not that it's bad, it's just complex. So it involves both a minimum and a maximum. You take the minimum of half the signature validity and half of the TTL of the old DNS key and 15 days. Typically, the TTL is the shorter of those. And then, if you take that value that you get plus a 1 hour value, and you take the maximum of either of those to generate how often in 5011 you're supposed to query for an update to the key records. So in 5011, security considerations, we're sort of changing sort of the maximum amount of, the minimum amount of time that you must wait while you're publishing a new key before you can start using exclusively it or it and newer keys. And so we called that in an update to the document, we call that an add wait time. And so the add wait time is now, the difference is now the add hold down time, which was the original 30-day window that everybody's more familiar with in 5011, along with the signature validity period, which is the signature expiration minus the signature inception, plus the query interval that we talked about last time, plus slop. So the slop is typically what we do in DNS here, which is 2 times max TTL. So in the end, it looks like this. And so I bring this up for a couple of reasons. We're going to get into this in greater detail in a minute, but Mike St. John's gave us a whole bunch of feedback recently, and I tried to get a new document out by today, failed, because he gave so many good suggestions that it took me a while to implement them. I'm down to like the last one. And then there's one issue as well, or actually 2. So first off, issue number 1, in revocation in 5011, in the document that is actually in the draft repository now is wrong. Thanks, Mike, for pointing out. Are you here somewhere? Okay, good, because we're supposed to hug it out later, apparently. So
pictures or it didn't happen.
Mike reminded me that the hold down time in 5011 is 30 days. But the remove hold down time is just really sort of a suggestion for how long you're supposed to publish it and how long the validator is supposed to remember that it's that there was a removal. So how long it should actually keep it around and think about it. And yeah, go ahead, Mike. You're gonna.
Sorry, this
says it exactly. This is just the database for the client.
Right.
It actually has nothing to do with.
No, but somewhere else you talk about, there's 2 times as quoted in 30 days. So both of those concepts are in there, I think.
The 30-day, the second one is removing a subsidiary trust point. And that's only one of the other places revocation is talked about. There's
Okay.
one more, and that doesn't have any dates, times on it.
So the change I'm making is what I think you'll be happy with, so that rather than having 1 wait time, which the last version of the document had, now there's 2. So there's an add wait time and a remove wait time, and really the only difference is for the remove wait time, we knock out the add hold down time, which was 30 days before, because revocation does happen the first time you see it. There's still a wait time. You can get replay attacks against you if you don't wait the signature validity plus these other terms. So it becomes that. That's issue number 1. That's functionally resolved unless Mike, finds a problem with it, and I will try and get that out this week sometime. Issue number 2 is unresolved. Here's just a quick example running through it. So from the current KSK. And again, the timing that ICANN has put forward, there is no reason to panic for ICANN's 5011, supported role of the current KSK, which is like underway now. The timing actually all works out. So these are the values that are in the current KSK revocation related rolling process. So the add hold down time is still 30 days. The signature validity for the current KSK is 21 days. And the TTL on those keys is 2 days. So when we plug in all the math and we do all those same min, max, and all that other kind of stuff, we end up with, and we keep boiling down the math and doing all the division, we end up with 56 days. That is much shorter than they are planning on waiting for that key to be in place. So none of the security considerations we're considering in this draft has any concern over the current key rolling process. And Mike, you were right. The math in the appendix that was in the example had 62.5 days. You were right. I was wrong. Thank you. For revocation, we delete the 30 days and we leave it at 26 days. So when the KSK is revoked sometime next year, it will stay in the zone for, I think, 70 days roughly. So much longer than 26. It's not going to be a problem. So the only issue left, and so all the rest of Mike's comments I've handled, and you'll see a longer post by me about responding to him. The only one left is that he and I had this internal debate about whether you should talk about an interval, so an add wait time, versus a wall clock time. And so, should you specify it as a wall clock according to the signature expiration? And to me, this is a matter of taste, because the reality is that the math has terms in it, some of which are wall clock terms and some of which are length terms. And so the end result is, either way, you end up having to fuzz one set of numbers or the other. So like the add hold down time is 30 days from publication, the signature expiration is a wall clock time, and the equations could really be structured as either. I found more wait terms than I did wall clock terms, and plus I don't want to change the document, I'll be honest, because I prefer it the other way. But because it's, like 1-to-1 right now, if anybody else has an opinion on his side especially, now's the time to stand up and say I'd prefer a wall clock equation.
Let me just ask the question. What's the term of the sum of a wall clock time plus an interval?
It's a wall clock time, yes, I know. But see, the deal is that this equation is very dependent, both of these equations is very dependent on when the publisher actually does stuff. So there's actually multiple wall clocks as well, because in this equation, one of those signature validities is the real signature validity, especially in the query interval. One of the intervals is based on sig expiration minus sig interval, and it's fixed, right? So no matter when you publish it. The other one, the first signature validity, the bigger one in this, is actually dependent on when you actually publish. So they're actually quite different. Warren?
Warren Kumari, just a minor clarification. You said things like that we're adding an add wait time and things like that. For people who haven't been following along, they might get the impression that we're changing 5011. This is just clarifications on how to use it more.
Yes.
Just for those who weren't, paying attention as it went by.
No, fair point. Oliver.
Just a slight comment. The timers you have are basically the worst case because
Yes.
number of implementations are more aggressive than the formula that is in there. Like
Yes.
unbound checks every day.
Well, you could have a query interval that's faster than 1 day too. So unbound may have an upper interval of 1 day, sure. So this is entirely based on the math in 5011 alone. If implementations, of course, do their own thing, they shouldn't be slower than the query interval.
No.
If they did that, they wouldn't be following 5011. So if they do stuff faster, by all means.
Yeah, so this is worst case.
Yes. So my implementation does 1 day too, or ours did. Yes.
And Wes,
Yes.
I think I was talking to you about 7853, the DNSSEC key timing rollover considerations document. And there, because a couple of the authors, I see them here, we didn't use wall clock, we used interval time. So that's just how it sort of worked out.
It's subjective in my opinion. It can go either way. So as I said, because I already wrote it one way, I don't really feel the urge to rewrite it. But if there's prevailing opinion, I will go through that work. So. All right. So unless I hear opinions either now or on the list, I get to pick, I guess.
And it sounds like when that's resolved one way or the other, sounds like the discussion could reasonably continue with a working group last call.
Yep. Yeah.
Great.
So the next slide is exactly that. I should have an update out. I was hoping by Monday, but I failed that, so it'll be out this week sometime. I will also release all the comments in response to Mike's very good set of comments. And in my opinion, and I think in Warren's opinion, it's ready for last call. So, and that tower is in Chicago, by the way. Okay.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
So next is a name.
Oh, a name. Yay.
Hello, my name is Peter van Dijk. I work for PowerDNS. I've been working on the A-name draft with Evan Hunt of ISC and Anthony Eden of DNS Simple. So why A-name? We've all seen zone files like this. You host your website somewhere where you don't host your DNS. So you CNAME your website out, but you cannot CNAME your Apex out. So you put an IP in there, and 1 year from now, this IP won't work. This is not the only reason to have A-name, but it's the most obvious, popular reason to do this. Solutions you see right now, you put a CNAME at the apex. This kind of works if you don't do DNSSEC. You use an operator that flattens this CNAME for you. I believe Cloudflare does this. You update your zone file from cron, so you have a name or alias, but it's hidden even from your name server, so it's somewhere in your provisioning. Then you have various commercial operators that do alias or a name under one of these names, and these are mostly similar implementations, but not all identical, and none of them interoperate over zone transfers. And then finally, our PowerDNS has alias, which is also quite similar to all these commercial implementations. So it is obvious there's a problem here, and there's obviously one solution. Okay, so this is an example zone file using a name. The website is still CNAMEd to the CDN, and the apex is a named to the CDN. You could, of course, use a name for both, but I'm trying to show the difference here. If you then do a query for the website, the www, you get a CNAME, and look closely. The website is a CNAME to the host at the CDN, and then you get the A record for the host at the CDN. In a name, this works differently. You get the a name to the CDN, then you get the a record again on the original name. This is so that resolvers that are unaware of a name will still get this address and still be able to direct the browser to the right site. There are various concerns have been voiced on Dnsop. DNSSEC is an issue. Depending on how you set this up, you may need online signing. There are many ways to do it without, but people are concerned about this. Loops are an issue. For a CNAME, you know what's happening, but an A name will be flattened by the resolver. And if an A name points to another A name, we imagine there could be undetectable loops there. and some work needs to be done. Another issue is GSLB, GeoIP-based or other methods for picking the right data center to point somebody to. If the authoritative does the A-name resolution for you, it will either have to pass on EDNS client subnet, etc., or you will get bad results. The draft proposes, for this reason, that resolvers do a re-lookup of the A-name, but we'll have to see if people will actually roll it out. And the final concern on this slide, anyway, there are more, of course, is that of the TTL, because you follow an A-name, this resolution runs via a resolver, you get a result with a limited validity. Do you pass on this limited validity, or do you cap it to some lower or upper bounds, etc.? The next steps, as far as I'm concerned, now that we are adopted, we need some running code. Many people have running alias A-name code, but not exactly according to the draft. The draft needs some restructuring. We have separate sections on authoritative and resolver behavior right now, but the primary and secondary authoritative behavior is all mixed up in that section, and it's confusing people. The draft needs more examples. Even this presentation has more examples than the draft. And one final thing, right now this draft mentions V4 and V6. The EDNS client subnet draft, or RFC, now mentions V4 and V6. The XPF draft mentions both. I imagine that it might make sense to do something about that, make it simpler for, if this is ever necessary, to create a new address type in DNS without having to update 8 other RFCs. That was it.
Hi, this is Andre Cizernik.
Hi.
Personally, I find the draft very confusing at the moment, because there's in the authoritative name server section, you say that the name server should resolve the A name to A and quote A, and then there might be records that coexist in the zone for A or quote A, and how do these play together? And there's a lot of other stuff like this. For example, in the DNSX signing section, if you have a key, do something. If you don't have a key, do something else. I think this needs to be simplified, because from the implementation side, I find it very confusing that there's a lot of mites, and a lot of different paths how to do one thing. So I think this needs to be simplified very much.
I agree. The draft has grown quite organically, and we need to fix that. Yeah.
Stefan Bartmeyer. I'm going to play the grumpy guy because the goal is to allow the user to use the Apex in user visible identifier like the URL, but it should be noticed that it's a HTTP specific problem, because all the other protocols have a way to do it through a DNS indirection, MX, SRV, etc. So it's only to fix a weakness, a big weakness of a HTTP. This being said, I agree with the solution, and it seems the right way, but still it's annoying that we don't fix it properly by fixing HTTP. I know it's an utopia, but it would be the best solution.
It is not the only thing the draft fixes, it's just the most obvious one. But thank you for your support.
Hi, Benno Overheim, NL Labs. So, first of all, I don't oppose against the draft, but I have a concern. It's not technical per se, it's more a fundamental observation or security observation, that the one who owns the zone and signs it might not be the publisher, even though you describe in the DNSX section that even though the master is not dynamic signing, there are ways to work around that. But still, that's the publishing side, and I might be the owner and only signing it, but not publishing. So with offline signing, I can sign it and someone else can publish it. And with this draft and becoming RFC, it has a number of, well, operational implications, or security implications. And I would like to ask your advice to write this also down in the security considerations in your draft.
Right, because
there's more.
you're saying right now you can sign offline with a key
Yes.
that's on a USB stick and do it again in a week, and now you have to do it every minute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also might be the owner of a zone and sign it, but I don't run any DNS server.
Right.
So and in the scenario that there's no online signing, you say, well, after the TTL, the authoritative name server has to resolve the A name, sign it, and do an EX3R to the secondaries, etc. But still, then I know in many practical situations this is the case, but it's a principle case. It's how DNSSEC was once designed and how it's now being used. And I think that's an important observation. It should be at least documented.
Yeah, yeah. Where the draft says offline signing can still be done, we are somewhat stretching the definition of offline.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm John Levine. I guess I have kind of the same concerns as everybody else. On the one hand, this is a problem that needs to be solved, and I have a hack in my DNS provisioning software to sort of kind of do it. On the other hand, I am concerned that I mean, I do offline signing. I have no intention of doing online signing ever, so it needs to work with that. And I'm wondering, maybe we could see if we could do something that smells more like CNAME, is like the A and quad A records, or just return the original ones from the source, like CNAME does, rather than renaming them into your own zone. And the other question is, I have this vision that we go through this entire process and we finally get it out, and the day after we publish it, somebody says, I do voice over IP. Why doesn't it do server records? I mean, I don't necessarily think we need a huge bitmap of every possible record type. But I do wonder. I mean, I understand the main use case is pointing at web servers, so you need A and quad A. But I'm just wondering if we've looked hard enough to see if there are people doing other services that use particularly serve at MX, that it's worth seeing whether we need to sweep them in too.
Yeah, we've given this some thought, and our main concern is that this would take the draft much farther from what's out there right now. So I imagine that we'll get.
Just so I do MX, but as far as I can tell, I'm the only one.
Okay. Andrew?
Go ahead.
Oh.
Andrzej Zawadka, I like this draft, but I don't like the idea of authoritative server resolving and online signing and everything else. I think it's too complicated to implement this in many scenarios. And I think it would be nice if, because I think it is there, but only implicitly, that an option that the A name record would be combined with A and quad A record of so-called last resort. So the authoritative server would do no processing at all. It would just add A name record to regular quad A and A answer. And in that case, recursive resolver that is capable of A name processing would get some better IP address according to indirection of A name record, but a normal resolver would get the A records of last resort. So we could somehow gradually go towards this A name solution without the complexity of server side resolving and signing and so on.
The draft as it stands allows you to do this.
Yes, but I think that it should be more explicit there, because as I read it, I didn't get it then.
Okay.
So this is my.
Good.
Hi, my name is Andrew Sullivan. So I said something along these lines on the list, but I feel it more strongly now. I've heard several people say things like, oh, it should just, or this doesn't cover my case, or it's too complex. And maybe part of the problem is that the document is insufficiently clear about why this is hard. Because what we're trying to do, right, is fake a whole bunch of stuff And we're trying to do it without changing all of the installed base of all of the garbage that has ever been shipped on the internet ever.
At least not today.
Right. And so there's a whole bunch of dependencies that, you know, and decisions that we've made over time, that maybe some introductory text that I guess I kind of volunteered to do now that I hear all these people are concerned about it, that would say, look, here's the reason why this is as hard as it is, would help motivate some of the trade-offs, and then we could stop having a discussion about, well, why don't you just do this? Because, for instance, John's point that he just made about the MX thing, well, I know of at least one implementation where a whole bunch of people would like MX to work fine, and the answer is, well, you can't because it doesn't. And so they come up with another, you know, they come up with a different hack, and that's the way that it's been done. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that's deployed already, and the reason it's deployed that way is because everybody's cheating in using the eventual consistency of the DNS to convince people that it works. So I think maybe if we write some text that sort of explains that's where the difficulty is, we might get a little bit quicker convergence.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have anybody else at the moment.
You got a little bit of work, but
Oh, well, and it sounds
promising.
sounds like there's a way forward. We've got next steps. Thank you, everybody. Next.
Should be session signal.
Sarah?
Okay, so I'm going to walk through an update on session signaling. Currently, this draft is at the 03 version that came out in July. The idea behind the draft and the phrase that's used currently in the abstract and introduction is that this is for managing the properties of long-lived sessions, for example, TCP or TLS. In this specific draft, we deal with two properties in terms of being able to set session timers and servers being able to indicate to a client retry times for certain operations. There are two or three, I'm not sure, drafts going through DNS service discovery. One of them is push, which use this mechanism and extend it to do subscription management. This draft uses a new format. It proposes using a new opcode, 6 is tentatively assigned. In the count sections, the draft says that the counts must be 0, therefore there can be no RRs within this kind of message. And what's proposed instead is a new TLV format, which follows directly after the count sections in the payload. The biggest point of contention with this is around the use of that new format. What I've tried to do on this slide is I walked back through the email archive and I just tried to gather the arguments that have been made for and against using that new format. The proposal to use the TLV, one of the ideas behind it is if we're going to use a new opcode, this is an opportunity to have a clean break from using RRs. RRs have fields in them, which, for example, when they're used in opt-RRs, the fields are overloaded. You could also argue that they're redundant. So there's a feeling that the RR format isn't necessarily the right one to use. Despite defining a new format here, what it also does is because we have an opcode, then the set of TLVs you have effectively form a new opcode space underneath the new opcode, because each of those TLVs is completely flexible in how you define the data in it. One of the arguments for not using RRs was that there are error cases, so you would have to worry about sessions signaling RRs ending up in normal DNS messages and vice versa. You have to deal with a case where these shouldn't ever reach a cache because they shouldn't get there. and a range of error scenarios. The counter arguments that have been made to say, no, we should stick with an RR even though we have a new opcode, are that parsing this within the name servers isn't that difficult. The issue is the knock-on effect to every element of the DNS ecosystem. So once you have a new format like this, all the string of tools involved need to be updated. So if you have wire to string or string to wire conversion formats, you've got to update them. You've got to update all your logging, any capture tools that you have, storage formats. So this has implications for CDNS, for DNS tap, etc. And any tool that wants to pass a DNS message will have to cater for this, because at the moment, by using RRs, unknown RRs can still be managed within that framework, or you can just extend it by adding a new RR. But because this is an entirely new format, those tools are going to get tripped up. The other argument is around all this error handling, and it's, well, we've already come across that problem with opt-RRs, so we kind of know how to solve it with this. And one thing I didn't put on the slide is, of course, if we're using this new format, we probably need to think about deployment issues, because think about the issues we ran into just by trying to use eDNS 0. To back that up, we did just a very little bit of limited preliminary testing. So Tom has a test tool which will send a session signaling message using opcode 6 and the new TLV format, and we fired that off at a few recursives. We found that bind and unbound appeared to do the right thing. They returned not implemented with an opcode of 6. OpenDNS returned not implemented, but the opcode was 0 in the response. Sorry, this was all done over TCP, I should say. Google, when it got this message, it waited a second, then it shut the TCP connection. We fired it at DKG's not resolver over TLS, and that immediately shut the connection. So these obviously aren't blockers, but we're making a list of, yeah, if we do this with the, there are some things that might need to be fixed. What isn't completely clear is whether this is simply the fact that there's a new opcode there, or whether it's a TLV format or a mixture of both. So we can do a bit more digging, but it's not a, oh, it just works everywhere. So that's where we got to yesterday, when the editors of the draft sat down and had a meeting, and what bubbled up out of that was a few other questions. We started thinking about actually using a new format, and we took a look at the text in 1035, and the way that that's written is very much, here's the DNS message format. You have counts and you have RRs, and you can have opcodes. The text it uses to describe an opcode is, it is a 4-bit field that specifies the kind of query in this message. It doesn't say anything more. So none of this indicates any expectation to use anything other than the standard message format. So it doesn't explicitly prohibit it, but it doesn't cater for it. So one question we have, is there any other document that clarifies that? That'd be great if there is, to have that reference. I believe Mark Andrews is participating remotely. I understand he has a strong feeling that there is nothing to prohibit doing this with an opcode, but this feels like an area needs clarification, because it feels distinctly that if we are going to use a different format, then this draft probably updates 1035. So it'd be good to discuss that. The other question is, we started thinking about the name and what facilities this new opcode actually provides. So at the moment it's called session signaling, but when we actually looked at how it's being used in service discovery documents, that name is actually a bit misleading. So if all you read is this draft in this context, the current framing and the current language could easily lead you to believe that this is just specifying a control channel, or a channel under which you create a context for regular DNS messaging to happen. The way it is being used in some of the other drafts is that it is also transporting data inside these TLVs. For example, in the push draft, the server actually sends the new updated data back to the client in a server-initiated session signaling message. In a more recent draft, which is the relay draft, that has this, in the latest version, it actually has the case where a MDNS wire format message is encapsulated inside the data of a TLV that goes as a session signaling message. So what struck us is that the way we're doing the spec is there is nothing that limits what can go in these TLVs. And so we just need to be clear about what you're getting by using this new opcode. And so we think we should rename it to something like just DNS session. In other words, this is a different way to do DNS within the context of a session that you set up with this mechanism. Assuming we detangled all of that, there are a handful of issues that are still outstanding on the O3, and these are ones that are noted in the document. Looking at the language there, the term session is used very liberally, and in the most recent update, we've realized we are updating 7766 in this, so we need to be clearer in the language, I think, about what a session is. Is it a 7766 session, or is it a session signaling session? So that needs some work. This version of the draft introduces two timers, one which is an inactivity timer, or the inactive timer, and the other is a keep alive timer. And I think we need a bit more work to describe the fact that we're introducing a kind of traffic, which is the keep alive message, which is special in the sense that it doesn't reset the inactive timer, whereas every other kind of message that's sent on this session will do. There's also some questions about ordering. The current text in the draft says that the server must act on messages in the order they are received. There's a subtle question, is that the order they're received or the order they are transmitted? And one of the areas this came up in is when we talked about the applicability of this to Quick. And it's still not 100% clear whether it is applicable to Quick or not. I think it is, given some discussions that we had. Christian, do you want to talk on that now?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that when we do things like Quick, we want to basically process the server to process the message as they are received, and the Quick transmission itself doesn't guarantee that the order in which they are received is the same as the order in which they are transmitted. Mm-hmm. Now, UDP doesn't guarantee that either. And the sentence that you have there is kind of weak, because must act, what does that mean? I mean, is putting the message on the queue acting? I mean,
right, so I think elsewhere in the draft we talk about you must process in order, in the sense that these tend to be, a lot of the messages in push are, subscribe and unsubscribe. So the desire for this was really that you are trying to process those as you receive them. But I take your point, it's slightly ambiguous.
No, it is very ambiguous, because, I mean, most of what you will receive will be queries. You will all...
No, not necessarily, I think.
So effectively, we have to be very careful there, that we don't create an artificial constraint that prevents normal processing, and that also we have the right thing.
Okay, so Stuart, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, Stuart Cheshire from Apple. I believe I remember the reason for that, which we can debate and may disagree with, but the reason was there may be operations that create state that future operations depend on. And so the intention of this was, if we wanted to support that, then the ordering had to be respected.
Well, there are two ways. You can either use the side effect of the transport to get your order, or you can have an explicit ordering somehow.
Right. So that's the decision we have to make.
Yes, because if there are transactions that change the state of the server, you have to wonder whether you should have several such transactions in the pipeline, or whether, on the contrary, you just one, or maybe in each transaction, you have a pointer to the previous one. I mean, that's a classic solution.
To sort of use the example that Sarah was using, one of the first clients of this is the DNS push notifications, where you can subscribe to be told about changes to a record, or you can unsubscribe. If the transport gets those messages out of order and the server receives an unsubscribe for something it's never heard about, is that an error? Should it return an error code? Or should it sit on that and wait for the subscribe to come in that it was canceling? And if so, how long should it wait for the subscribe? So there are problems on both sides.
No, but what you would do there is that, I mean, suppose that you want to request that the client doesn't put the server in a bind. You would say that the server will actually reject and unsubscribe if it has not seen the subscribe, because that's an error. It might even do something nasty. But the client should wait until the subscriber has been confirmed to send an unsubscribe.
So that would be another way of solving the problem. And I don't feel strongly. So if the working group can decide which one we're going to pick, that's fine. If we can rely on a transport like TCP to deliver things in order, then the client doesn't have to wait a whole round trip for the confirmation before it can proceed to the next step, right? It's not limited to doing one request ping pong and waiting for the act before it proceeds.
I get that, but what you're describing is an optimization that says that if the client doesn't wait, things are flowing freely. The cost of that optimization is that you're mandating a sequencing transport.
Yes.
Which has its own cost. I mean, it's also, I mean, so basically you have one design that at times to gain performance one way, but loses performance the other way. So it's.
I don't think I want to spend a lot of time. I mean, it sounds like you prefer something that doesn't require the transport to deliver things in order, like TCP. Is that like a quick summary of where you stand? Okay. So I'd be interested in hearing other people's opinion, because I really don't mind. It's one of these tricky decisions where either solution would work perfectly fine, and those are the hardest to agree because it goes 50-50.
Yeah, it sounds like it needs to be pursued on the mailing list and in the bar.
So Ted, I mean, just an additional sort of complexity to that is that so session signaling generally carries state. So you definitely want anything that's sent after a session signaling message to be processed after the session signaling message. If you don't do that, the state will not apply to it, and that's bad. And then there's the other case, which is where you just happen to have two DNS messages in a TCP connection or a quick connection that are not session signaling messages, and they are sent in a particular order. And the question is whether you need to process those messages in a particular order or not. So I think there's actually two different things, although in practice you either have ordering or you don't. So maybe it doesn't matter.
Right, I don't think we address the issue at all of what the ordering of the non-session signaling messages. I think we've restricted it to the session signaling stuff because that's where the state is. But yeah, maybe we need to make a statement about that.
Yeah.
Andrew Sullivan, the other thing that I would mention is that there were other uses here that were intended to be just, you've got this session and now you can reuse it. So it's not nothing that you know, some of these things could be processed out of order that'd be significantly advantageous in other cases. So I think I'm increasingly persuaded by Christian's argument, but it occurred to me, and I said this in the Jabber channel, that that we might take a page out of DNS Update's book here because it has prerequisites.
Okay, right.
Petr Špaček, CZNIC.
Yeah.
I was screaming loudly about the wire format on the list, so let me scream here. Basically, the proposal, if I understood it correctly, is using new opcode and new format at the end, right? So from my perspective, it seems like specification which is creating DNS version 2 over DNS version 1, right? Because the DNS version 1 is just the header, which is like without any value, no data at all, and at the end, there is something completely unrelated to the previous DNS. So maybe it's time for the clean cut. I'm not insisting on the old DNS, just, don't combine these two together because it doesn't seem related. Okay.
Should we let you finish the rest here?
I
or
don't
you-
have much less on the slides, and then we can let the bun fight commence. If you, yeah.
I think the bun fight has already
I
commenced,
think
but it's your bun
something
fight.
got lobbed, didn't it? So,
It's your bun
so I'll very quickly run through these. So just minor things that we need to also take into account. We state in the draft that an empath proxy should not blindly forward this. We don't actually state what empath proxies should do with it. And also in the 03 version of the draft, we explicitly state that name compression is forbidden. And it dawned on us that having DNS wire format messages encapsulated inside TLVs is in conflict with that, so we probably need to revisit it. There were a couple of other issues which are noted in the draft, but we haven't come up with a solution for. One is the fact that if you don't have an additional section, you can't do TSIG, and then you can't do any eDNS 0. And the main use case we could see for that we lost with that was being able to pad these messages. So a solution was proposed to add a padding TLV, but it's not in the 03, so that does need catching up with. And there was previously a more fundamental question about, does actually every message require a response? Because it's DNS, that feels natural, but in some of the service discovery cases, it feels really redundant. And I think the relay draft actually does away with responses in some cases because that's natural to the message flow. The last thing to say before we move into the discussion is that, as I've said, there are several drafts in service discovery, in particular push, that depend on this normatively. So this is holding up that work. So this is something that it would be really good to get to a resolution quickly on. And I'm all open on ideas of how we resolve the TLV versus RR debate that don't involve rock, paper, scissors or arm wrestling or whatever. But this is one of those cases where I think we have two camps, and I'm not sure how we move forward on that. So that's for the working group too.
Yeah, we have a couple more
discuss.
minutes. Yeah, we have a couple more minutes because actually we were a little bit ahead of time, but that discussion, which felt very productive, so we didn't stop it, kind of put us back on schedule. So we have a couple minutes now, and definitely we do need to continue the discussion, on the list and in the halls, because if there's a relatively quick resolution of these things possible, we should do that.
This is Henri Seasoning. I'm actually torn about the new format because for introducing new format, I'm not actually concerned about the people who are here because, well, those are just, minor glitches and we can fix that. But you might be aware of my new crusade, the DNS violations, and I've seen a lot of new implementations coming up and people implementing DNS protocol in various languages and stuff like that. And those are the people who are generally not here. And those are who, when I'm concerned about introducing a completely new format, because from those implementations I've seen, they generally tend to ignore the things that are stable. So they might not parse the opcode and stuff like that, just ignore that and try to parse the TLV as a DNS format and then break horribly. So, so on one side, I'm with Peter on this, but on the other hand, if we break this barrier, this might lead to a new development in the DNS protocol, like reinventing some things we did wrong in the past. But that leads me to other concern I have with this. It's actually the padding stuff and other things like this. You dropped all the improvements, all the useful improvements we introduced to DNS, and you are implementing this in TLV, like the keep alive, the padding, and I'm not sure I like this. I think I don't.
We could end up with a whole bunch of duplication here just because of that kind of thing. Like, oh, I'll do it in TLV as well, and
Yeah, and I probably hated the duplication more than I dislike the new format.
Okay.
Ted Lemon. Yeah, so I mean, the duplication issue I think is a real issue. But EDNS 0 sucks. I mean, it's really a pain to work with. It's an RR, right? It's not not an RR, and that's you know, that's very circular, but it's the whole point of what we're doing here is to represent things that aren't RRs, right? And
Yes and no, I think. I mean,
well, does it keep alive an RR?
no, but
Right.
a encapsulated MDNS message could be an RR.
No, it's not. It can never be an RR because it's a message. It contains RRs, yes,
Yeah, but it
but
could-
it's not an RR.
Yeah, but we're not precluding things that could also be RRs under this format.
Yeah, yeah, you could definitely
So-
stuff an RR in here. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the whole point. It's a totally
Yeah.
flexible format.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, that's what's good about it. And you know, as far as like you know, some random device out on the internet crashing or returning a bad result because it gets it. First of all, if something doesn't look at the opcode and tries to parse the payload as right. Well, right. If something, yeah. This is Stuart's making the point that all of the counts are 0. So so you would have to be really broken to actually try to parse the payload of this packet if you didn't look at the opcode, right?
Yeah.
I just don't see how that would happen.
Yeah.
But you know, if it did happen, it's actually good news to some degree. Like, you know, oh wow, my thing blew up. I wonder why.
Yeah. And
You know,
but also
that's a terrible implementation, and,
Yeah.
and it's vulnerable to just random stuff being thrown at it. So it's not our fault.
But you could say that, you know, we've also got to accept that then we might hit problems with middle boxes that
Oh, yeah.
don't like this, and we hit a horrible deployment issue.
Right, but we already have that with EDNS 0, so that's not a difference between this
Well,
and EDNS
well,
0.
We need to consider that, but we need to continue that particular point on the list and closing the mic.
Okay.
Matt Poundset. Yeah, I'm a little bit ambivalent on the format issue because it seems to me that the TLVs essentially create a control plane, a separation of control plane and data plane where we don't currently have one, in a sense.
not really, because there's nothing that restricts you to passing only control data in TLVs.
Yeah,
Absolutely nothing.
I'll get to that in a minute. And I like that. It enables all sorts of things, potentially solves problems we currently have using EDNS 0, enables all sorts of things that we can't do currently. As somebody who implements monitoring and you know, log processing and all those things, I'm not particularly concerned about the extra work. If I don't care about TLV messages, I will ignore that opcode. If I am concerned about them, then it doesn't matter to me whether it's an RR or TLV. I have to write code to process it anyway. So there's that. I'm a little concerned about the issue of embedding DNS messages in TLVs. That seems a little bit odd to me. I remember having a conversation with somebody, I think it was in Berlin, about push notifications and how that might work and things. And the picture I had in my head when we were having that conversation was a TLV would set up the session, set up all the, a client could send a DNS query with some sort of.
Can I just make a quick comment, because I think you're mixing up two drafts. The push notifications is not what this is talking about.
Yeah, I know, but it
embedding-
depends on this, and it.
No, the embedding is a different draft. It's the relay, not
Is it?
push notification.
Okay, that's
totally
fine.
separate.
Sorry to butt in here, but Ted Lemon, the other draft, I'm not at all attached to doing it that way.
Yeah.
I'd be perfectly happy to just do session signaling as its own thing and have the other packets be in line.
Yeah.
So it's actually, you know, if the working group wants to do that, I'm totally cool with that.
Yeah, I guess it feels to me like sort of a layer violation, and I'm concerned about the possibility of things like DNS over HTTP over TLV over DNS. Like we can end up, it enables some really weird things that I don't think we need to embed DNS messages in the TLV itself. So.
Stuart Cheshire, Apple. Couple of comments. One quick one. I want to put a slightly different nuance on what you said at the start, Sarah. you said that you wrote the session signaling, and then Tom and I came along and modified it or something. I know that's, no, you're shaking your head, and that's fine. All I wanted to say was that the spirit we approached it was you created this document that defined this new container format, and we thought we were embracing that in the spirit that you and Ray intended, and it's only recently that we found that, that we read more into the document than you intended. But we were actually not trying to, we were not trying to change the document. We actually thought we were embracing the spirit of it.
Yeah, I think it was a genuine disconnect there in what the expectations were. And also there are two very different use cases for this, I think, and that's where the viewpoints differed.
On this question of TLVs appended on the end versus a pseudo RR, I think Ted summed it up very nicely that an EDS0 opt record is not a resource record, and it's also not a resource record. And that is the problem. You're cramming this data into slots in a format and giving them different meaning, because the resource record has a TTL and a class, but for an opt record, they don't mean that, they mean something else. And you actually don't cache an opt record for the time that the TTL says you should cache it for, because it doesn't mean that, it means something else. And as a result, the Wireshark decoder for that record type has to display different labels next to those fields and parse them differently, because it may be 4 bytes, but it's 4 bytes with a different meaning. So I think it's a bit an illusion to say we can just use an RR and you don't have to change the code that parses it, because things like Wireshark did have to change the code, and caches had to know not to cache that record because it's not actually a record. So I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that just making it look like a record makes the problem go away.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't make it go away. I think it changes its magnitude a little bit, but this is all about the trade-offs here between having the new format and the impact on all the tools, etc. And it's just about weighing up those pros and cons.
Francis Dupont, I read the first draft about this, and for me it's totally new protocol, so there's no reason to reuse. Really, we should just get rid of the past and start from scratch. And I can't see which kind of code we can reuse, and for sure we don't want to reuse the name compression code, for instance.
Oh, sorry. We'd sort of cut the line because we're sort of running out of time. Go ahead. I was just talking. Unless it was very, very 5
Okay,
seconds.
quick. Tom Pusateri. I was just going to say I like the TLV format because this stuff is session related and it makes you think about it differently and treat it differently. And this separation is, I think, a good thing.
Thank you. This has been really good. I hope it's been helpful to the editors.
I think what we're hearing is slightly tipped towards the TLV side. Or that's
So
what
you're
I
going to
take
work
from
on the
that.
revision, and if there are additional issues where we need more feedback to get done-ish.
Yep.
This is actually a good candidate for an interim.
Yes, actually.
And get
yeah.
everybody that's interested, and maybe some of the folks in DNSSD or other groups that are watching this work also.
Yep.
We could do an interim just about resolving the last issues for this.
Okay.
Also, if anybody was in Deep Dive this morning, I had Daniel Gilmore present a draft about muxing DNS and HTTP over the same port, which people were horrified for. Though many people actually were trying to solve the problem, which is not what we were trying to do. We were trying to warn people that there are these bad architectural things you can do if you're not paying attention to stuff, right? And I think one of the concerns I have in this is we just want to make sure, and I think we heard that about, duplicating stuff in TLVs versus ours, are we doing something that's going to fundamentally cause some breakage, right? Or cause something bad to happen as we go down the road. And I'm just, we should sort of consider that as we're sort of reading this draft. And I think a few people have sort of said that. So that was the only thing I wanted to sort of say about that. So thanks, sir. Go. You have a little clicky? Go.
You can click it. Here's a clicky.
Have a cookie.
For those of you who don't have the context on this bulk RR, back in Berlin, I believe, is when the CenturyLink folks originally brought it to us, and it was their first effort with the standards participation process, and so it was of their original design, but they looked for a little IETF help in moving it along, and that's why I jumped on the project. For those of you that don't have the full context of exactly what the proposal is, essentially it's a way of putting Bind's $generate feature into an RR record that could then be shared in zone transfers in order to dynamically generate records. It's really based, a lot of people were under the impression it was built around regular expressions, but really it's only based on matching numbers. And a quick example here shows you how one record could then generate, for example, a whole bunch of address records or PTR records or what have you. For this draft, the version 06 draft that was just published on the 3rd of this month, right at the deadline cutoff, because that's the way we all do things, the main goal here was to simplify the draft. So a lot of it was changing around to make the language a lot more straightforward. This actually had a significant effect on the total page count. We dropped it by 50%. Some of that was not just, of course, from the language clarification, but things like taking out a couple of features. Like there was this feature where it tried to modify wildcard semantics essentially to hide the effect that, you know, to hide the overt evidence that pattern generation wildcarding was in effect here. This is driven by some operational issues that the folks at CenturyLink had, where they see, for example, you may be familiar with mail servers that will try to detect that your reverse address space is, you know, dynamically from your pool, and therefore shut down your MX connections. So they were really trying to avoid that particular issue, and it's still a question that they want to have addressed, but at the moment, a bulk RR doesn't have any special requirements for trying to hide its existence. We also removed some of the octet value restrictions to make it a lot more DNS-y. That is, originally, they defined patterns as only being in terms and the substitution data that you could use only in terms of the US ASCII character set, in particular printable characters. And the DNS, as we know, does not have this particular restriction. And so even though it's unlikely you're going to want anything other than US ASCII, nonetheless, to make it more consistent with the rest of the protocol, it now essentially allows any octet. We also, some things were kind of wide open. The way it was originally defined, you could have any number of references being used for substitution, limited only, I suppose, by the size of a unsigned short for your entire message length. But in practicality, you're going to want far fewer than that, and so we tried to limit it. I think the current number is 32, which would give you every nibble of a IPv6 address. So tried to make that a lot more constrained as far as simplifying your implementation might go. And then there are a whole bunch of other clarifications that exist in the draft. There's still other ideas that want to be pursued. In particular, as I mentioned, the original design goal included really modeling a lot of the $generate behavior as far as being able to format the way records looked. And the thought there, again, was that having familiarity, you know, that people would see that and go, oh, this is just like $generate inside a record, might help move things along faster, but it might be possible that $generate itself was just a little bit too flexible in what should be expected out of its format generation. There's also another record in this draft, the NPN record, which was supposed to help with DNSSEC. Essentially, it gave a DNSSEC light version for these generated pattern names. It wouldn't allow you the full expressiveness of being able to say that this particular pattern would always generate this record, especially in the context of trying to hide the bulk record that actually generated it. But it turns out that, you know, as I was trying to write it up and clarify it, there are significant DNSSEC rollout issues here that really suggest that if you want to use bulk RR probably and the DNSSEC sign zone, you'd probably have to use online signing. Other ways of dealing with it, for example, even signing the bulk RR record and not trying to come up with a special record, all of those have big enough hurdles that it doesn't seem wise to address it for the basic use case that's desired here. And then last but not least, another thing that I want to end up talking about, and I'm surprised that John Levine, I don't think he mentioned it when he was up at the mic a moment ago talking about a name, but there's an issue. Did you mention it and I just tuned out for a second? So the issue is essentially that while some people, some famous DNS cognoscenti have declared on mailing lists that it is a myth that rolling out a new RR is hard, that is relatively true when you're adding an RR that's just shipping around data that nobody is supposed to look at what the R data is. When you're adding something that actually has semantics on the server, you can easily get in the situation where your master is, your primary server has this record and then is being transferred to servers who have absolutely no idea how to handle it, and now your zone is broken. So this is a problem that extends beyond bulk RR, but it's a problem we really need to be talking about to try and figure out. Maybe we can use a session signal TLD to say. In any event, it is a genuine issue. Some text has to be added. I don't think the bulk RR itself is going to solve the problem, but it's a wider issue that the working group has to consider. And we would like to adopt it as a working group document to move forward. These other what's mentioned here, I think, can easily be done under the auspices of finally being a DNS document.
Okay. Yeah, we have a few minutes for comments, and then we can take the call for adoption to the working group list, if that's
Sure.
okay with you guys.
Am I picking? Just go. Fight it out.
Peter first.
Just very quickly, a name has a gracious fallback behavior for secondaries, but sadly, I don't see how you could do this for bulk.
Right. Rob?
Yeah, Ralph Weber-Namen. I mean, the DNSSEC validation that requires changes on the result really should be something else. I mean, because this has value without it, and I mean, you can deploy it without it.
Right.
Paul, I just read that. So I haven't read this in a while, but it's true that, is it true that you can see the difference between a bulk generated records and real PTR records?
No, I mean on the wire, what you get into your resolver would look like just a normal PTR record.
Okay, then I'll sit down.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm still John Levine.
Yes.
And I have to say that this latest version is much less horrible than the previous version. But if that sounds like faint praise, it is. And I mean, I still have a bunch of issues with it. I mean, I think there's a certain. I mean, I think these records with semantics that secondaries don't know about problem, it's one that I guess when we invented DNSSEC, we hoped it would never happen again. And there's still some possibility for that. I mean, we already, in the DNS blacklist world, we have a stunt server called RBL DNSD that does kind of this stuff, okay? And nobody has ever asked to have RBL DNSD's junk put into the standard DNS spec. It's a stunt server. It does one rather peculiar thing, and it does it pretty well. And indeed, what you have here is, now that you sort of de-overgeneralized it, as far as I can tell, this is essentially a way to generate, to wallpaper the V6 reverse address space. And I don't see that as a big enough issue to be worth all of the damage to the DNS or all of the DNS cruft that this requires. I said, like, why don't you guys just write stunt servers and use that? It's not as nice. I realize, I understand that it has operational issues because you have multiple secondaries with multiple other providers. But I don't see the issue of getting them to support your stunt server as being meaningfully different from getting them to put in all this stuff. Okay, and my final thing is for DNSSEC, I think you just bite the bullet and say, if you do this, you have to do online signing. You should do something like Cloudflare's malicious lies and just and
malicious lies all over.
Well, you know what I mean. But basically, like, do the signing. Like we know ways to sign to sign records that are generated on the fly.
Right.
So do them and don't ask people to carry your water for you.
Yeah. I'm closing the mic line after Andrew, unless somebody is desperate, or after
Andre's up.
Andre. Okay. Mic line closed. Go ahead.
Andre 3. John took most of my comment I had, just drop the NPN and require online signing. But on top of that, the DNSSEC keys have 2 bytes specification of the usage. So why not we think about adding a special type of DNS key just for signing the bulk records?
Yeah. I've had a similar thought that you could have a couple of keys in a zone, one of which is for static signing of, for a zone that actually mixed this 2 types of data, that your static key, offline key could sign everything, and then you'd have your one online key that would do the rest.
Yes, because then you can use this key to, give to secondaries, and you will not be afraid that it will sign all the other records.
Right.
Or something in this space. But the NPN is just, the deployment and the implementation is just, it will be too complicated.
Yeah. Andrew?
I'm Andrew Sullivan. The reason I got up here is because of John's remark, well, why don't you just got these stunt servers, why don't you just go off and do that with your friends? The reason that people don't want to do that is because it's the same reason that we're all here in this room. This is the reason for standardization, that we want to be able to work interoperably with various other people on the internet. So despite the fact that somebody who's probably paid for my presence here would dearly love to close this all up and sew it up nicely so that nobody else can play in this space. The purpose of getting together and standardize things this way is precisely so that we can create more competition and have a better ecosystem. I think that's important.
Yeah, and I'll follow up to say that I also think it's important. I mean, my own employer, who also I do not speak for, does have, and among the many modes of its authoritative name server, one that does work on regular expression patterns. And so we could perfectly well set this up for a customer who says, I want to do this really large zone. Can you just automatically generate it instead of having to transfer, dozens and dozens of megabytes in zone transfers? So we're already capable of doing that, but I believe it's to our to the industry's advantage, especially in the wake of some problems that we saw in just the past year, to allow for a multi-vendor setup and to be able to share features like a name and like pattern generation of names and so on. So.
Dimitri, speaking for myself, I just think that making DNS Turing complete is generally a wrong way to go. But I would just say that putting computational resources to another party is, again, conceptually wrong. So not because I don't like mine or I don't like generate. I see why people need this, but I just think if you take this one step further, it would go in the wrong direction. So
yeah, I will point out that all the computational resource part of this is just going to be on the auth server. The client gets just the record that they asked for.
Oh yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Do you want to hum just to get a sense before bringing it to the list, or? Okay. Different groups do it differently.
Yeah, we'll take the call for adoption on the list, because I suspect that what you're talking about are some very significant changes from the previous version, and I'm not sure people have had a chance to really.
It was out a whole week ago, Suzanne.
I know. I'm here for you, but. So you have. There's 2 more presentations, and they're on at least somewhat related, and I want to make sure we get to both of them.
Yeah, and I'm going to go really fast on mine. The chair seems to think that these are more related than either of the drafts authors think
I just want to make sure we get to both.
Different sides of the multifaceted coin.
And so, and I will leave it to, I think Mukund is presenting his. I will leave it to him to just.
Stephen Morris.
Okay, to describe what the salient differences are. But in the case of serve stale, the proposal here is essentially really only meant to cover cases where things are humming along just fine, and then the authorities go out to lunch when you're trying to resolve a name. We don't change the semantics of the TTL at all. They would still be essentially, so we don't change the immediate semantics of the TTL, in that the TTL still defines the maximum time before which you should attempt to refresh. However, traditionally, resolvers have then expunged the record from the cache when they encounter an expired TTL. What this says is, keep it around for a bit longer, and the bit longer is defined a little bit later. But essentially, when you come across authorities, so you can't get an answer from any authority, then within a short period of time, you should send a response back to the client before the client times out. There's currently a recommendation that this should be around 1.8 seconds. Then your resolver, though, keeps trying to get it up to whatever its normal fetch timeout is. Bind used to be 30 seconds. I think they've cut it down to 10 seconds now. Different resolvers use different values. It's not really that relevant to the doc, other than don't wait just 1.8 seconds. You should keep trying longer than that. And in this particular case, also, negative responses are considered to be a successful refresh. If you had your www.example.com was responding with an A record and now it's NX domain, the NX domain is a successful refresh. That is what you should be serving, even if you have to rely on a stale answer in the future. And then after another period of time, which is currently recommended to be days, to allow for manual intervention at the authorities for fixing whatever problem is going on with them, even over a long holiday weekend, eventually then you expunge the data, so you're capping your cache size and everything. You know, at this point you have a real problem back the way you would have had in that very first period. And the goal here is to balance data integrity with resiliency. Because most of the time in our operational experience, the answer that you had before the TTL expired is still the answer that's going to work even after the TTL is expired. Most TTL refreshes for us come back with the same answer. And so the key here is at least try to get a fresh answer before you decide you're going to use that stale answer and then move on. It works. I wrote a patch for Bind 9 back in 2011. It has smoothed over a lot of temporary instability and even prevented several major incidents for us, things where you know, our web servers would have tried to connect to Origin and failed because their provider had come under DOS attack, for example. It's been contributed to ISC now for inclusion in Bind 9.12. I don't know what the current implementation status is, but that was my understanding. Oh, getting a thumbs up from Vicky. And while both Akamai and Google do have patents that cover this area, Akamai's in particular, that was assigned from Xerocol, really spells it out, that clearly covers it. We have both had our official IPR statements with using the license declaration to be provided later, but the code was contributed to ISC under the Mozilla public license. And so, you know, even though it's still technically will be provided later, we expect it just to be freely available. And the big questions we have are, you know, Warren and I are even not completely in agreement. These timers that existed because this was what worked in our environment when I originally implemented it, but it is worth discussing to see, are these the right recommendations to make? And we would think otherwise it's pretty straightforward and could move along pretty well, and so we'd like to see working group adoption and just push it on through. Do you have anything to add, Warren? Yeah. He had submitted TTL fuzzing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Phenomenon. So this is a huge deviation from what actually the DNS sort of protocol was supposed to or doing. But my main concern is this is supposedly be standards track, and it describes one implementation pretty precisely. And the draft notes that are other implementations like Unbound, and we have one, and I think Cisco also has one, which might also have IPR on that. I think it might be worth actually writing up something more on the requirement side and what, if you want to do that, what to do and what not to do. But this is far too specific into the applications and the implementation side, I think. And I mean, definitely not standards track. Maybe experimental information or something.
Well, so again, with it changing the idea of what the TTL means and what the expected standard behavior would be on the internet, I think it is absolutely relevant to being standards track. And, you know, like you say, yes, this is one particular implementation, but I'd also very much welcome feedback on what's a better way of doing it. Like, how would that change, you know, what aspect of the requirements would change under a different implementation?
Well, as I said, there are different ways to achieve that goal by serving stale records, and there are different implementations that have done different approaches, and this is just one.
Well, and that's, I would like to understand better what those approaches are, and in fact, whether they make more sense or not. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess Warren Kumari. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we're in any way wedded to this. So if other implementations want to describe their implementation, we can include those as well, or something similar. This is not definitely the best way. If yours works better, or if you're willing to describe it in similar.
I'm not sure if it's working, but I think what we need to have here is a sort of description of requirements, what to do in the case in such cases and what not to do, and then have implementers sort out how to do it.
Or what if we sort of do that and say one implementation does it kind of like this, more towards an appendix C type thing, possibly as an option.
Yeah, so, and to be clear, because I'm not exactly sure how my response came across initially, but I am in favor of the idea of saying, yes, lay out what the requirements are, and, I still think it's useful, though, to describe then at least one way of achieving the requirements, and to the extent that there are other ways of achieving those same requirements, I'm happy to describe them as well.
Benno Hoogreiner and Nelnet Labs. Thank you for bringing this to the Dnsop working group. So indeed, similar questions is about the IPR and a previous work of art. So OpenDNS also had something like. Is that included?
I actually, it was when I was looking for open DNSs to see if they had a patent or something, is when I found Google's patent that mentioned open DNS.
Okay.
And was unable to find, and to the extent that there's a disclosure to make there, somebody make it.
Okay. And so Akamai, you said, well, for us, it's, well, as we contributed the code, we expect it will be available. And it's also for Google as the same.
So, to be honest, I didn't know about the IPR until David found it. And then one of our lawyers looked at him and was like, I can't really tell if this applies, and I don't really know. So, they filed as much as seems like it could possibly be something that applies to this, but it's sort of off on the sides. So obviously I'm not a lawyer. I've been poking our lawyer to see, to try and provide more info. But they're not hugely interested in actually,
But thank you both for bringing this to the working group.
This is Henri. Well, Rolf said most of what I wanted to say, but for the timers, I don't think that the hard timers are correct in this case, even for this implementation. I think they should be derived from the original TTLs from record, because the intent is not to serve a record that has a 30-second TTL for a week. It doesn't seem correct. But if it's a way to how to save a domain under attack that has a TTL of 2 weeks for another week, that seems okay. So somehow you should derive those numbers from the original TTL. That would seem better way how to define.
I'm happy to discuss that on the list, but I think that's actually the exact reverse situation of what you want. Somebody has a long 2-week TTL, they're unlikely to be under attack for that long that it's going to impact that many people who have their record cached, whereas somebody like a CDN, not just a CDN, but that has, very short TTLs, it's easy to make an attack that would cover, last long enough to cover even several TTL expiry periods. So.
Giovanni, SIDN. It's great work. I think it's very interesting also because there's a current trend of a lot of people moving their services to cloud providers, and there's a risk of collateral damage in shared infrastructure. So if you have something in place like that, you kind of remove over the long term let's say, the incentives for attacks to DNS infrastructure. So I think it's good work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, read the draft, review the draft. Stephen Morris to talk about opportunistic refresh. And we've taken our beating for considering these drafts related.
Thanks. This is a draft written in conjunction with Mukund Sivaraman and Shankar. Right, consider the normal case of events. We query for the body record www.foo.com. It stays in our cache for TTL. The record then expires. A little bit later, we query for it again. It's not in the cache. We have to do an upstream fetch. Now let's suppose that before we before we do the second query, we query for another record from the same zone, foo.com MX. We'll also make a couple of assumptions here. We will assume that with every response, we retrieve the serial number of the zone, and we will also assume that the serial number of the zone uniquely reflects the contents of the zone. In other words, if the zone changes, the serial number changes. Now, if the two serial numbers are the same, then we would be entitled to assume that had we queried for www.foo.com at the time we queried for the MX record, we would have got the same answer. Olafur.
Serial number has nothing to do with whether zone has changed or not if you are not using normal zone transfer. I calculated the serial number on the fly.
Okay, I said that that was an assumption. I'm dealing with that. I'll deal with that assumption in a couple of slides' time. Now, going back, if the serial numbers were the same, and then with our assumptions, we can assume that the zone contents haven't changed. Had we queried for the same record at the time we queried for the MX record, we would have got the same data. Therefore, we are entitled just simply to extend the TTL of the record we have cached. So when we come to query for it at T1, we don't have to do an upstream fetch. We've saved ourselves a query to the authoritative server. So the zone serial information, how do we get the zone serial information? We could send it along in an EDNS record, but the zone already has that information in the form of an SOA resource record. So the simplest solution seems to be to just add the SOA resource record to the response. It's pretty clear, but just to emphasize, in order to extend the TTL, the serial numbers must match. We can't make any assumptions if they're different. So now, let's address those two assumptions that we get the SOA resource record, and that the serial number reflects the zone. It's said that a fundamental theorem of software engineering is that every problem in computer science can be solved by adding another level of indirection. And when I was preparing this presentation and looking back over some previous RFCs, it occurred to me that a similar thing applies in our field of work. Every DNS protocol problem can be solved by adding another EDNS option, and that's notwithstanding Ted Lemon's somewhat negative opinion of them. So we have the client adding an EDNS option to the query, and it's asking the server to return that SOA resource record. If the client doesn't need it, in other words, if there's no option, the server doesn't add it, so we're saving bandwidth. The server adds the EDNS option to the response as a guarantee that the zone change is accompanied by a version number change. So this is an operational thing. By enabling this option, the zone manager is saying that every time my zone changes, I will update the serial number. So that's the basic idea. We just submitted this draft. There are questions, issues. So the first one, is it actually useful? It's not going to be useful where the zone changes frequently. It may be of limited use in small zones, something with just a www record. But on the other hand, if they're signed, something like this means you only need to fetch the DNS key once. The second question is, should we extend the TTL of NS records this way? NS records are special Because although the child is authoritative for the NS record, the resolver has to go to the parent zone to check if the delegation is still valid. And what we want to try and avoid doing is permanently extending NS records and never finding out that the delegation has changed. Is that server's EDNS response option really needed? Because it could be argued that simply adding an SOA resource record to the additional section can be interpreted that the server supports, that the server is saying that the version number changes, the serial number changes when the zone changes. We did have a discussion of this. I mean, my feeling is that the response is needed, because otherwise we're assigning a semantic meaning to the position of an SOA resource record in the response, which I don't know, I'm just unhappy with. A real can of worms is how should we cope with ECS, where the response coming back depends on subnet. So you get an SOA. Is it covering everything? Is it covering the subnet? There has been some discussion of that. And finally, security. Matthias Mecking on the list did raise the issue that we thought about, is what happens if an attacker can send back a response and then just add this SOA result, just add an SOA resource record in. I mean, in many cases, signatures are valid for much longer than the TTL, and so you could potentially maybe keep records in a resolver cache way beyond what they should be. So that's basically it. Questions?
Yeah, we are at time, but we can stay. So any comments on this? And I think the other thing I want to do before people start escaping,
Dan, we're actually 5 minutes over.
Thank you for that interruption. It used several more seconds. Reviewers,
Yeah.
I think the primary next step here is we do need people, since it is a new draft and since these questions are relevant and irrelevant, we will be looking for reviewers for the draft to decide whether it's useful and interesting and whether it should have further work from the working group. Thanks.
Lars Lehmann from NetNode. I think there was one assumption that you left out, which is this can only click in when you're talking to an authoritative server.
Yes, that's right.
So this mustn't be allowed to happen. The response mustn't be allowed to happen when you're talking to
that's right. That's right. It is mentioned in the draft. I didn't say it here. Andre?
To answer a question, if it's really useful, I think the effect will be really marginal because you need support for the EDNS response option, and I think you do this to answer to your first question. Also because we try to minimize the answers, and now you are blowing them up again. So I think you need the EDNS response option, and in this case, the effect will be only marginal because of the deployment.
Yep, that's a valid. Roy?
Roy Adams, I absolutely love this idea. I'll support it. I'll review. I'll keep my responses to every individual things here. I'll keep that for the list. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not entirely sure how to answer whether it's useful. I think that requires a little more thought, but it seems like it might be. I'm a little concerned about the notion of extending the TTL on NS records and any DNSSEC material. That requires a lot more thought.
Agreed.
I had previously got questions from ICANN doing TLD operator moves that, well, how do you plan to deal with in your timing with, if somebody extends an RSIG to its validity period rather than the TTL, and my response to that has always been, well, they can't. And this may change that, which potentially causes some problems.
Thanks.
So I thought that it was only me that the bad idea fairy visits, but this is really cool.
Thank you.
So one of the things I'm not sure if it's going to be all that useful because you need to do another lookup into the zone. And I'm not sure if the way that lookups happens that often, right? I do a lookup for dub and maybe 2 other things, and then possibly not for a long time. If it turns out that I'm incorrect, and that does happen often, some analysis, then I think it's useful. I don't think you should extend the TTL of NS, just I'm not sure
No,
that
no,
feels
I
sketchy.
mean, it's,
I don't think you need the EDNSO thing. ECS and security, who knows? Alex.
Alex, may I have a quick comment? Actually, I find this interesting and probably useful as well. Have you looked into simulating that and how
Not
much
yet,
packets
no.
you actually spend?
No.
And the second point is, as an alternative, have you thought about defining an ETNS 0 option that simply returns the zone update timestamp?
we thought about the an option return timestamp, but the advantage of the SOA RR is that if the zone is signed, you've got signatures with it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Jim?
Thanks, Steve. Just a statement of bleeding obvious, first of all. Maybe it'd be a good idea to try and gather some data as to whether this would actually be an effective technique or not. Will this actually benefit caches? My second question, which mine has just had a complete brain freeze for a moment there. So now if I wait for let Shane so you can gather my thoughts again.
Hi, this is Shane Kerr. I'm one of the authors listed on the draft, although it was mostly McCoon's idea, and Stephen did all the work, so I'm happy to be on the list. So in terms of whether it's useful, one idea that we have is that you can actually look at authoritative server logs, and you can look at, I've identified a pattern of queries where you can actually look at the queries that you've gotten and estimate what benefit you would have gotten. So if you have access, so I'm going to go through the DIDL data, which is a bit tricky because it's mostly a delegation-only domain, but we can look at DS records and things like that. But if you have access to big authoritative zones, then talk to me and we can figure out a way to actually do some measurements and estimations. It may be possible, there may be some ways that you can do some estimation on the resolver side, but it's tricky because you don't have the data, which is why we need the draft. So,
yeah. The unfrozen Jim.
Thanks, Steve. I remember what my other point was. This is probably a stupid idea, but I'll mention it anyway. How about using a timestamp rather than relying on source semantics?
Yes, you can use a timestamp.
Yeah, I'm thinking so that the authoritative server says this is the last time I loaded the zone.
You could do that, but if the server's going to do that, why should it not update the serial number when it does so?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the scenario that Olafur was talking about before, about people are doing funky things with SOA records, where you might not necessarily be able to guarantee that the SOA record changes when the zone content changes. This could be another mechanism potentially.
No, valid point.
So one thing, I mean, there are servers out there that have no concept of serial or last zone updates. They are sort of driven from the database backend and have no idea of when the last update was.
Yeah, but I mean, this idea is completely optional. The client will include the ETNS option in the query. The server's free to ignore it and just not return the SOA resource record. Okay,
So
thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If you haven't signed the blue sheets, they're around here somewhere. Thanks for your time. We do have another session Thursday afternoon for some additional proposed new work. But for now, we are done. Thank you very much, everybody.